Welcome to Wallace Anwar. Today, we're talking about Tengku Zafrul's successful trade negotiation with the United States. And we're jumping straight in because, well, the argument Tengku Zafrul made about these trade talks is huge, really consequential. He's claiming, quite strongly, that these efforts were absolutely critical. Said they stopped immediate job losses for about 1.1 million people here. That's the number. 1.1 million jobs. It's basically a claim of saving a huge chunk of the national economy.
Yeah, and it's so important to grasp the scale of this right away. This wasn't some minor adjustment. We're talking about, what, over 7,700 local companies? Companies whose whole business model pretty much depends on exporting competitively to the U.S. So when you connect 1.1 million livelihoods directly to the fate of those 7,700 firms, well, you can see the government was under immense pressure. They needed a fast, decisive strategy, something effective to protect those economic foundations.
Let's look at the amount of trade that was actually on the line. The numbers are pretty staggering. If you look at the trade between Malaysia and the U.S., just for January to September this year, it hit RM 270.9 billion.
And that's not just a flat number, right? It's growing. That RM 270.9 billion, it's actually up 15.4% compared to the same time last year. Last year was around RM 234.68 billion. So the negotiations weren't just about protecting what we already had. They were about protecting our biggest area of recent trade growth.
Right, and that growth makes the whole thing incredibly sensitive. If those talks had collapsed, or if, say, the diplomatic approach was just dropped, the U.S. was basically ready to slap on some really severe tariffs that would have just killed that growth instantly.
Oh, absolutely. And the threat wasn't just theoretical, it was very real. We know the U.S. had already announced a potential 25% tariff. That was back on July 7th. So that policy was officially there waiting. It created this immediate hard deadline, which, must have really shaped the negotiation timeline and the government's urgency.
And Tengku Zafrul's view on what that 25% tariff would do, it was universally grim, wasn't it? He argued it would just make Malaysian goods instantly uncompetitive in the U.S. I mean, if your cost jumps by a quarter overnight, demand just shrinks, profits evaporate. And for those 7,700 companies, the only logical step is cutting costs, starting with, well, that huge wave of layoffs he mentioned.
And if you start looking at which sectors were most exposed, you see where the pain would hit hardest. The minister was specific about this. He pointed to electronic and electrical products, E&E. That's the most valuable export category at risk. And when we talk E&E from Malaysia, we're often not talking finished goods like phones or TVs. Malaysia's strength is really in that high-value back-end stuff, semiconductor assembly, specialized testing, packaging.
Okay, let's dig into that E&E risk a bit more, because that detail matters. When you say semiconductor testing and packaging, these are really specialized, critical inputs for global tech giants, right? So what part of that supply chain were the U.S. tariffs actually targeting? Was it everything?
Well, that's the core issue. A 25% tariff, it doesn't just make the final gadget a bit pricier for someone buying it in the U.S., it messes up the entire global supply chain, that whole just-in-time system. These Malaysian components, they're specific links in a really complex global chain. The second those parts cost 25% more than similar ones from, say, a nearby country, well, global manufacturers in the U.S., in Europe, they immediately start looking around. Vietnam, Thailand, maybe Indonesia. Not because their parts are suddenly better, but because they offer stability, tariff predictability. That's the real long-term danger you see. Losing our place in that global structure, not just losing one quarter's sales, which brings up the other side of the coin. What if Malaysia had decided not to negotiate? Or maybe gone aggressive, put counter tariffs on U.S. goods? That kind of move, what would have directly harmed an export market worth around RM 198.65 billion for us? That kind of self-inflicted damage would have been incredibly harmful to the whole economy.
And we keep circling back to that 1.1 million jobs figure. It's a number designed to convey urgency, clearly. Did Tengku Zafrul's team offer any insight into how they calculated that specific number, that linkage between direct and indirect jobs? Because a number that big, while definitely attention-grabbing, it naturally makes you ask about the methodology.
The public statements didn't seem to detail the exact economic model they used, but they did sort of categorize the jobs at risk. The estimate was something like 60% were direct manufacturing jobs, mostly in E&E itself. The rest, the other 40%, that accounted for the vital support chain. Logistics companies, specialized contractors, all those small, medium enterprises making components for the big exporters. So maybe the exact final number could be debated, but the concentration of risk, that seems clear, and it justifies why they needed that fast, high-level diplomatic push.
Yeah, that RM 198 billion export market. It's the lifeblood for so many Malaysian businesses. Tengku Zafrul kept emphasizing that the whole local supply chain, particularly the SMEs tied to exports, the machine shops, the service providers, local logistics, they would have been hit instantly and hard. They're so closely linked to the success of the exporters.
Exactly. And that flows right into the longer-term damage investor confidence.
Yes.
The minister was really clear on this. Failure to get a stable tariff rate would have immediately pushed companies, both local giants and foreign multinationals here, to cut costs sharply. Layoffs are bad enough, yes. But the real long-term hit comes from delaying or just canceling planned investments, expansion projects put on hold. That kills future job growth.
So that's where the threat really multiplies, isn't it? Failure doesn't just hurt us now, it messes up our future growth path. Because investors, whether they're Malaysian firms or big foreign corporations, they're rational. They look at the numbers. They'd naturally start shifting their money, their expansion plans towards other countries in the region, places offering lower tariffs and, crucially, more predictable environments.
Right. Predictability is key.
And that shift directly weakens Malaysia's ability to compete for those high-value manufacturing projects down the line. Okay, so given all that pressure, that massive risk, how did the government actually manage to succeed? Tengku Zafrul described the winning formula as a whole-of-government strategy. For people listening who aren't familiar with that term, what does that mean in practice? Like boots on the ground?
It basically means breaking down the usual government department walls, getting everyone working together, synchronized. So it wasn't just the Ministry of International Trade and Industry talking to their U.S. counterpart, the U.S. Trade Representative. That's the normal way. Whole of government meant the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was also busy working diplomatic channels. The Prime Minister's office was engaging right at the top, presidential level, cabinet level. Even the Finance Ministry was involved, running economic models to show the U.S. how damage to Malaysia's supply chains could actually hurt the U.S. economy too. Reciprocal damage.
Wow, that sounds like exhausting coordination. But it shows real political will, doesn't it? It wasn't just technical trade negotiations. It was sending a message that this was a top national priority right up to the Prime Minister.
Precisely. And that unified front, that seriousness, it likely made a difference to the U.S. negotiators. It allowed the Malaysian team to move quickly when the opportunity finally arose. And the breakthrough moment, as reported, was that high-level talk between Prime Minister Anwar and U.S. President Trump. They reached an agreement on October 26.
And the result. What was a tangible outcome of all that intense work?
The result was essentially keeping things as they were, which in this high-stakes situation was actually a huge victory. They managed to keep the existing U.S. tariff rate on Malaysian goods at 19%. The critical success was stopping that increase to 25%, that potentially crippling 25% that had been announced back in July. They basically diffused the ticking bomb.
Let's just underline how significant keeping that 19% rate is. That one decision immediately stabilized things for those 7,700 plus exporting companies. But the human side is what really counts here. It protected the jobs, the incomes of those 1.1 million Malaysians in those industries, people who were facing huge uncertainty just months before. It was diplomacy buying real, immediate economic stability. So the main takeaway here for you listening to this, Tengku Zafrul's argument is pretty straightforward. Proactive, high-level, coordinated negotiation made all the difference. The difference between economic stability and potentially massive unemployment. It was the shield that protected that vital RM 270.9 billion trade relationship with the U.S.
And looking forward, it's important to remember the threat of tariffs hasn't vanished, especially under the current U.S. administration. We dodged the 25% bullet, yes, but Malaysia is still dealing with a 19% tariff rate. So it raises a really interesting question for you to think about as you process this. What tariff level, somewhere between the current 19% and that proposed 25%, do you think is the actual breaking point? At what point does Malaysian competitiveness in the U.S. market really erode, forcing those 7,700 companies to seriously consider relocating or making major job cuts? It's something to consider.
Remember to like and subscribe for more videos like this.